You know it's bad when your best customer ghosts you and doesn't even leave a note. That's what just happened to the US auto industry. For decades, American car makers could count on Canada as a reliable partner, almost a loyal sibling in the family business. But now, Canadian drivers are quietly turning their backs on US-built cars. No protests, no hashtags, just a silent, economically driven retreat. And the fallout is starting to look like a slow-motion collapse when that Detroit, somehow, didn't see coming. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next. And you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. This isn't about ideology. No one's burning flags or shouting in the streets. It's just cold, hard math. Rising vehicle prices, brutal tariffs, and more appealing alternatives have pushed Canadians to buy elsewhere, mostly from Mexico, Japan, and Korea. And while US automakers were busy fighting old battles, Canada quietly shifted the game board. For the first time since the 90s, Canada now imports more vehicles from Mexico than from the US. That's not just symbolic. That's structural. This is a reordering of the entire auto ecosystem in North America, and the numbers don't lie. Detroit's Big Three, Ford, GM, and Stellantis, once had deep roots in Canada. Those roots have been quietly rotting for years. Long before tariffs even entered the chat, American automakers began scaling back production in Ontario. Plants shuttered, shifts were cut, and the golden age of cross-border car manufacturing started to rust. So when Canada dropped a retaliatory 25% tariff on US vehicles, it wasn't the start of a war, it was just the final push. Prices on American cars shot up by thousands. And with wages stagnating and interest rates climbing, Canadian buyers weren't in the mood to stay loyal. Not Yep. While Detroit was stuck looking backward, Japanese and Korean automakers went full throttle in the north. Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai poured investment into domestic Canadian plants. Ontario and Quebec, once-side characters in the North American auto narrative, became leading players, especially in electric vehicle production. And now, they're positioning themselves as the future of green car manufacturing, with billions being funneled into EV and battery plants. One of the biggest moves? Honda's jaw-dropping $15 billion investment into a Canadian EV hub. That's not a placeholder. That's a power play. Meanwhile, back in the US, the ripple effects have been painful, and not just for automakers. In Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and other industrial states that once thrived on Canadian demand, factories are scaling down, orders are shrinking, and uncertainty is setting in. This isn't just a dip. This is what a silent boycott looks like. It's not loud. It's not political. It's economic, and it's nearly impossible to fight. Even worse, the US auto sector walks straight into it. The 25% counter tariff? Meant to punish Canadian policy, but all it did was punish the US car industry. Those extra thousands tacked onto each vehicle didn't just make American cars unappealing, they made them unviable. At the same time, Canada was being courted by the competition. Mexico's role in the North American auto game exploded. Lower labor costs, strong production lines, and aggressive trade positioning made Mexico an increasingly attractive export partner for Canada. And the numbers reflect that. More Canadian imports from Mexico than the US, a milestone that tells you everything about where this market is headed. Meanwhile, Japanese and Korean brands weren't just exporting to Canada, they were building in Canada. That's a strategic difference. While American brands stayed rooted in an old model of cross-border shipping and centralized production, the imports adapted. They localized. They invested. And they earned customer trust. Let's not downplay it. Canada and Mexico are becoming the new power axis of the North American auto scene. And this didn't happen because of a massive trade agreement or some sweeping international decision. It happened because consumers followed the numbers. Policy made prices worse. Consumers responded. Industry shifted. No hashtags. No headlines. Just pure relentless market logic. What's even more ironic? While US officials were worried about foreign competition overseas, the real threat to their dominance was just across the border. And the scariest part for US automakers? This shift is sticky. Once consumer behavior realigns, it's hard to snap it back. Brand loyalty fades. Habits reset. So where does this all go? If trends hold, Canada and Mexico will increasingly become the brain and muscle of EV manufacturing in North America. Ontario and Quebec already have the infrastructure and investment momentum. Mexico has the labor force and production efficiency. And the US? It's stuck in a lagging position, burdened by pricing issues. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next. And you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Updated strategies, and a shrinking share of what used to be its most reliable export market. This is a wake-up call. But is anyone listening? Because if the US auto industry thinks it can tariff its way back to relevance, or simply wait out consumer frustration, it's going to be a long fall. The market doesn't care about legacy. It responds to price, availability, and trust. And right now, American cars in Canada are failing on all three. This story isn't over, but the plot has definitely turned. And unless Detroit finds a way to make itself competitive again, not just in messaging, but in cost and production, its days of calling the shots in North America might be numbered. The takeaway? Consumer choices are louder than protests. And in this case, Canadian drivers didn't shout. They just walked away. If you're as shocked as we are about this silent industry shakeup, hit that like button. Drop your thoughts in the comments, especially if you're in Canada and made the switch yourself, and don't forget to subscribe for more breakdowns of the wild twists happening behind corporate doors. Because sometimes, the quietest moves make the biggest mess. And here's where things start to unravel in slow motion, because this isn't just a Canada problem. It's a North American reckoning. You pull one thread in this tightly woven supply chain, and suddenly, factories in Michigan are cutting hours, small suppliers in Indiana are seeing fewer orders, and dealership lots from Buffalo to Des Moines are looking just a little emptier. Not because Americans stopped buying cars, but because one key export pipeline has quietly dried up. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's just empty spreadsheets and unreturned purchase orders. That's how a market collapses quietly at first. And remember, this isn't about nationalism. No one in Toronto is angrily rejecting Ford because of politics. They're rejecting Ford because that $38,000 SUV now costs $45,000, and the Hyundai built 2 hours away is thousands cheaper, more fuel efficient, and eligible for provincial EV incentives. It's economic gravity. People are going where the value is. Meanwhile, US automakers seem trapped in a kind of corporate denial. Instead of adjusting pricing models or rebuilding trust in cross-border value, they've doubled down on a playbook that's starting to feel dangerously outdated. Tariffs as leverage? That ship has sailed. Consumers have moved on. And Canadian shoppers? They're not just reacting to tariffs, they're building entirely new habits. This is how market dominance dies, not in a dramatic explosion, but in a slow, quiet shift of attention, a turning of the head, a closing of the wallet. Canadian manufacturing, on the other hand, is having a moment, a serious moment. Japanese and Korean brands saw the writing on the wall early. They realized that local production, especially for EVs, was the future, and they didn't wait. They built facilities. They created jobs. They aligned with government green initiatives. Now, Ontario and Quebec aren't just car manufacturing hubs, they're the future of the continent's EV push. In fact, some segments of the Canadian auto sector are already outpacing their US counterparts in efficiency and production volume. That's not just a flex, that's a shift in gravitational pull. The magnetic center of North American carmaking isn't Detroit anymore. It's drifting north and south. And here's where Mexico becomes the wild card. While the US and Canada were trading policy jabs, Mexico was scaling up production like a silent powerhouse. Lower wages, friendlier trade environments, and ramped-up output turned Mexico into the go-to partner for countries wanting North American access without the baggage of U.S. tariffs or rising labor costs. So now, Canada is buying from Mexico more than from the U.S., and again, it's not about politics. It's about cost and convenience. Mexican-built vehicles hit that price-performance sweet spot Canadian consumers are looking for. They're cheaper, efficient, and crucially easy to import under trade agreements that now favor south-of-the-border partnerships over legacy U.S. ones. What we're seeing isn't just a dip in exports. It's a foundational restructuring of where cars come from and where the money flows. And American factories, which once sat confidently at the center of it all, are watching their relevance fade with every missed quarterly target. It's not that U.S. carmakers are producing worse vehicles. The quality argument isn't the issue. The problem is that they've become economically unattractive in a region that's never been more price-sensitive. Canadians aren't rallying behind slogans or waving flags. They're just following spreadsheets. And right now, those spreadsheets say, buy anywhere but the U.S., which brings us back to Detroit. The spiritual home of American car making, the industrial icon that once symbolized economic might and engineering excellence. How did it get outmaneuvered this badly? A lot of it comes down to complacency, the assumption that brand loyalty would protect U.S. manufacturers, that Canada, as a neighbor and longtime partner, would keep buying American just out of habit. But loyalty doesn't survive a 25% price hike, and nostalgia doesn't pay the bills. Tariffs weren't just a bad move, they were a self-inflicted wound. The 25% counter tariff from Canada, meant as retaliation, hit American manufacturers right in their soft spot. It didn't just raise prices, it handed the competition a golden opportunity, and Japanese and Korean brands took it. While Detroit was busy playing defense, others went on the offensive, offering better deals, more reliable delivery, and product lines that actually reflected what buyers wanted. Fuel efficiency, EV options, advanced safety features, all without the bloated price tag. It was a masterclass in market agility. And now, the U.S. industry is in a bind. Because the Canadian consumer base wasn't just important, it was essential. Losing that steady stream of cross-border buyers doesn't just hurt, it reshapes the game board. Supply chains are being redrawn. Manufacturing investments are shifting. And future plans? They're starting to leave the U.S. off the blueprint. It's the kind of shift that doesn't grab front-page headlines, but leaves lasting scars on the ground. Communities built around auto manufacturing are suddenly seeing layoffs and slowdowns. Small suppliers, dependent on volume, are teetering. It's a domino effect, and at the start of the line is a simple purchasing decision repeated by millions of Canadians. No thanks. Not at that price. And once that choice becomes habit, once a generation grows up seeing Hyundai and Toyota as the default option, the alternative, good luck winning them back. That's the real threat. This isn't just about a temporary slump. It's a generational realignment of brand preference and consumer behavior. And unless U.S. automakers find a way to compete not just with flashy ads or dealership gimmicks, but with real, structural changes in cost, efficiency, and strategy, they're going to keep losing ground. So, what now? Rebuilding won't be easy. Tariffs can't be undone overnight. Supply chains can't just snap back. And consumers, once burned, don't forget. The U.S. auto industry needs more than a course correction, it needs a complete strategic overhaul. Because the competition has changed, the consumer has changed, and the map of North American manufacturing has officially been redrawn. The writing's on the wall. Canada and Mexico are rising. And unless Detroit can figure out how to reclaim its footing in this new economic reality, it's not just going to fall behind, it's going to get left behind. The car industry was built on movement, momentum, and evolution. But right now, the U.S. is stalling out, and the rest of the continent isn't waiting. And here's the thing, once you really step back and look at it, you realize this wasn't just a pricing mistake or a policy blunder. This was decades of arrogance finally catching up to the U.S. auto industry. The kind of arrogance that comes from being on top for too long. From assuming that your place at the head of the table is permanent. From believing that your neighbors will keep choosing you, even when you're not the best option on the menu anymore. Well, Canada has officially stopped ordering the usual. For years, American automakers leaned on the idea that Canadian consumers were baked into their ecosystem, that no matter what happened, labor disputes, factory closures, trade tensions, they could always count on the Canadian market to show up. But economic loyalty has an expiration date, and when costs started rising, incentives started disappearing, and better options started rolling in from local Toyota and Hyundai factories. That quiet Canadian loyalty turned into quiet Canadian indifference. And indifference is way scarier than outrage. Because outrage gives you something to fix. It means someone's still emotionally invested. But when consumers stop caring altogether, when they simply leave the dealership without saying a word, that's when you know the shift is real, permanent, and almost impossible to reverse. Meanwhile, Canada didn't just switch brands, they leveled up their auto industry in the process. Japanese and Korean automakers didn't swoop in with flashy marketing. They showed up with jobs, with plants, with long-term investments in electric vehicle infrastructure. They built their credibility from the ground up. And now, they're reaping the rewards. Ontario and Quebec used to be treated as satellite operations by the Big Three. Now, they're becoming core pillars of a completely different supply chain, one that doesn't revolve around Detroit, one that doesn't rely on American exports, one that, frankly, might be better suited for the future of transportation. Because let's not forget, this is all unfolding while the global EV race is heating up. And right now, the US isn't leading it. Canada and Mexico are moving faster, pulling in more EV investment and restructuring their industries for long-term resilience. They're not building cars for nostalgia, they're building cars for the next 50 years. And consumers can feel that. This isn't just about saving a few bucks on a vehicle. It's about sensing which brands and countries are actually invested in tomorrow. In sustainability, in affordability, in local jobs, in meeting people where they are. Meanwhile, American carmakers keep showing up late to their own party. When they're not raising prices, they're scaling back EV goals. When they're not asking for government bailouts, they're fighting union negotiations. It's a cycle that's become exhausting to watch and even more exhausting to trust with your money. So when a Canadian buyer walks into a dealership today, what are they seeing? A $45,000 American SUV that just jumped in price thanks to tariffs, or a $36,000 Japanese crossover, made in Ontario, with better fuel economy, local parts, and a full EV version coming next year? It's not a hard decision, and consumers are making it over and over and over again. That's the quiet revolution happening here. A slow bleed. A market shift that's so subtle and grounded in logic that it's almost invisible until it's not. Until factories close. Until sales reports tank. Until entire communities start feeling the absence of what used to be dependable export demand. And still, there's this eerie lack of urgency from the US side. As if Detroit thinks this is just a phase. As if it believes that eventually, the market will swing back and Canadian consumers will return like nothing happened. Thanks for sticking with us through this breakdown. If you're feeling the fallout of this shift, or just have thoughts about where the auto world is headed, drop them in the comments. Like if you learned something new, share if you know someone watching the EV transition unfold, and subscribe for more stories that dig into the real drama behind the headlines. Because in an industry that runs on movement, the biggest meltdowns happen when people stop paying attention.